we started our discussion on this entire matter, you had pointed out three things that we will be focusing on while the hearing is underway. One, what the CBI says. Two, if the Supreme Court agrees for a stay on the HC verdict. And three is what exactly defines public servant in this very case and the very interpretation of the POCSO Act. While the first two questions, or rather the first two focal points, have been looked after once this Supreme Court verdict is out, I think it's the third question that still looms large. What exactly is to happen in this very case after the vacation is over for the Supreme Court, or rather the courts in the country right now, and then when they again resume, will there be a plea that's filed into this very case? What exactly will be the next legal step for both the Unnao rape case victim as well as Kuldeep Sengar's lawyers representing him in this very case?
Well, Shreya, no scope of imagination is this case already over before the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court has just issued notice in the matter, which means that the Supreme Court will hear arguments on merits as to whether or not that order that had suspended the sentence of Kuldeep Sengar, whether that order was correct or not, is something that the Supreme Court will be looking at, no doubt about that. But at the same time, something important that needs to be stated and clarified over here is that when we are talking about the law, there are two things. There is the letter of the law and then there is the spirit of the law. The Delhi High Court might have followed the letter of the law, but it is the Supreme Court of India today that has actually upheld the spirit of the law, where they have actually gone ahead and stayed that particular order. And when there is a dichotomy between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law is when substantial questions of law arise that the Supreme Court needs to take a deep look at. That is
आराम से सेटल हो जाओ, आराम से हो जाओ,
मैं जान गया, चोट ना लग जाए कहीं, मैं अंदर ही आ जाऊं, अंदर ही आ जाऊं तो बेटा, हाँ अंदर आ जाइए, ठीक नहीं, अच्छा नहीं लगता ना ऐसे, चोट लग जाएगी किसी के, भाई साहब चोट लग जाएगी किसी के, चोट लग जाएगी, चोट अंदर आ,
अब हो गया, सेटल हो गया सर,
नहीं हुआ ना वो, चोट लग जाएगी, मैं अंदर
आ जाइएगा। मैं तो अच्छा मोबाइल पे कर रहा था, मैं मोबाइल पे रुक गया।
Viewers, yes, we see all the reporters out there, in fact, waiting for those reactions from the advocates, all the representatives of either sides in this very case right outside the Supreme Court. We too are bringing to you all those voices in terms of what they have to say as to how the proceedings continued in the Supreme Court on the very hearing. But yes, Nalini was continuing to tell us about how this particular case is to proceed from here. Nalini, please continue.
Well, Shreya, like we were stating, and we're also just awaiting a reaction from Mahmood Pracha, who is present here in the Supreme Court lawns. But like we were stating, the Supreme Court is now essentially going to be looking into how the term public servant has to be determined by a court of law. Whether the definition of the public servant should be limited to what is written in the text, in the law, in the provisions of the law itself, or should it be more open, more interpretive, wider in its expansion to decide who is the person who can be brought under the ambit of the public servant. That's going to be the larger fallout of this entire judgment that has been given by the Delhi High Court, because the Delhi High Court has essentially put in place that a person who is an MLA cannot be considered to be a public servant. So it's now up to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not that interpretation was right. And this interpretation, like I was stating earlier, this substantial question of law occurs whenever there's a dichotomy between the letter of the law when something is written versus the spirit of the law. What was the intention when the legislation was enacted? Especially a legislation like POCSO. What was the intention of the lawmakers at that time? Was it only to protect the persons, the vulnerable section of the society, or was it also to hold the people in power accountable to a higher level, to a higher pedestal than any other normal person? So all these questions is something that the Supreme Court will be looking at. They have issued a notice to Kuldeep Sengar. He is expected to respond within 4 weeks, after which arguments on merits will happen in the case. Today, the arguments were only limited to the aspect of stay, which the CBI seems to have swept in its favor, where the stay has essentially been granted.